In natural theology, a cosmological argument is an argument in which the existence of a unique being, generally identified with or referred to as God, is deduced or inferred from facts or alleged facts concerning causation, change motion, contingency, or finitude in respect of the universe as a whole or processes within it. It is traditionally known as an argument from universal causation, an argument from first cause, or the causal argument. Whichever term is employed, there are three basic variants of the argument, each with subtle yet important distinctions: the arguments from in causa, in esse, and in fieri. The basic premise of all of these is the concept of causality and of a first cause. The history of this argument goes back to Aristotle or earlier, was developed in Neoplatonism and early Christianity, and later in medieval Islamic theology during the 9th to 12th centuries, and reintroduced to medieval Christian theology in the 13th century by Thomas Aquinas. The cosmological argument is closely related to the principle of sufficient reason as addressed by Gottfried Leibniz and Samuel Clarke, itself a modern exposition of the claim that nothing comes from nothing, attributed to Parmenides. Contemporary defenders of cosmological arguments include William Lane Craig, Robert Koons, Alexander Pruss, and William L. Rowe. History. Plato and Aristotle both posited first-cause arguments, though each had certain notable caveats. Plato posited a basic argument in the Laws, in which he reasoned that all movement in the world and the cosmos was imparted motion. This required a self-originated motion to set it in motion and to maintain it. Plato posited a demiurge of supreme wisdom and intelligence as the creator of the cosmos in his work Timaeus. Aristotle argued against the idea of a first cause, often confused with the idea of a prime mover or unmoved mover in his Physics and Metaphysics. Aristotle's famous argument was contrary to the atomists' depiction of a non-eternal cosmos, which he argued would require an efficient first cause, a notion that Aristotle took to demonstrate a critical flaw in the reasoning. However, a non-eternal cosmos, with both a beginning and an end, would later come to reflect the prevalent theological beliefs in medieval Europe, by simply denying that an efficient first cause is problematic, being easily explained as the creative action of an omnipotent God. Medieval theologians repurposed and enhanced Aristotle's argument, as if the intention had been to prove God's existence. Like Plato, Aristotle believed in an eternal cosmos with no beginning and no end. In what he called first philosophy, or metaphysics, Aristotle did intend a theological correspondence between the prime mover and deity functionally. However, he provided an explanation for the apparent motion of the fixed stars. According to his thesis, immaterial unmoved movers are eternal unchangeable beings that constantly think about thinking, but being immaterial, they're incapable of interacting with the cosmos and have no knowledge of what transpires therein. From an aspiration or desire, the celestial spheres imitate that purely intellectual activity as best they can, by uniform circular motion. The unmoved movers inspiring the planetary spheres are no different in kind from the prime mover. They merely suffer a dependency of relation to the prime mover. Correspondingly, the motions of the planets are subordinate to the motion inspired by the prime mover in the sphere of fixed stars. Aristotle's natural theology admitted no creation or capriciousness from the immortal pantheon, but maintained a defense against dangerous charges of impiety. Plotinus, a 3rd-century Platonist, taught that the one transcendent absolute caused the universe to exist simply as a consequence of its existence. His disciple Proclus stated, "The one is God." Centuries later, the Islamic philosopher Avicenna inquired into the question of being, in which he distinguished between essence and existence. He argued that the fact of existence could not be inferred from or accounted for by the essence of existing things, and that form and matter by themselves could not originate and interact with the movement of the universe of the progressive actualization of existing things. Thus, he reasoned that existence must be due to an agent cause that necessitates, imparts, gives, or adds existence to an essence. To do so, the cause must coexist with its effect and be an existing thing. Stephen Duncan writes that it was first formulated by Greek-speaking Syriac Christian Neoplatonist John Philoponus, who claims to find a contradiction between the Greek pagan insistence on the eternity of the world and the Aristotelian rejection of the existence of any actual infinite, referring to the argument as the kalam, cosmological argument. Duncan asserts that it received its fullest articulation at the hands of Muslim and Jewish exponents of kalam. Thomas Aquinas adapted the argument he found in his reading of Aristotle and Avicenna to form one of the most influential versions of the cosmological argument. His conception of first cause was the idea that the universe must have been caused by something that was itself uncaused, which he asserted was God. Versions of the argument. Kalam cosmological argument. William Lane Craig gives this argument in the following general form: whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe had a cause. Craig explains, by nature of the event, attributes unique to God must also be attributed to the cause of this event, including but not limited to omnipotence, creator, being eternal and absolute self-sufficiency. Since these attributes are unique to God, anything with these attributes must be God. Something does have these attributes, the cause, hence the cause is God. The cause exists, hence God exists. Craig defends the second premise, that the universe had a beginning, starting with Al-Ghazali's proof that an actual infinite is impossible. However, if the universe never had a beginning, then there indeed would be an actual infinite, an infinite amount of cause and effect events. Hence the universe had a beginning. Argument from contingency. In the scholastic era, Aquinas formulated the argument from contingency, following Aristotle in claiming that there must be something to explain why the universe exists. Since the universe could, under different circumstances, conceivably not exist, its existence must have a cause, not merely another contingent thing, but something that exists by necessity. In other words, even if the universe has always existed, it still owes its existence to an uncaused cause. Aquinas further said, "And this we understand to be God." Aquinas's argument from contingency allows for the possibility of a universe that has no beginning in time. It is a form of argument from universal causation. Aquinas observed that, in nature, there were things with contingent existences. Since it is possible for such things not to exist, there must be some time at which these things did not in fact exist. Thus, according to Aquinas, there must have been a time when nothing existed. If this is so, there would exist nothing that could bring anything into existence. Contingent beings, therefore, are insufficient to account for the existence of contingent beings. There must exist a necessary being whose non-existence is an impossibility, and from which the existence of all contingent beings is derived. The German philosopher Gottfried Leibniz made a similar argument with his principle of sufficient reason in 1714. There can be found no fact that is true or existent, or any true proposition, he wrote, without there being a sufficient reason for its being so and not otherwise, although we cannot know these reasons in most cases. Quote, he formulated the cosmological argument succinctly. Why is the something rather than nothing? The sufficient reason is found in a substance which is a necessary being bearing the reason for its existence within itself. In esse and in fieri. The difference between the arguments from causation in fieri and in esse is a fairly important one. In fieri is generally translated as becoming, while in esse is generally translated as in essence. In fieri, the process of becoming is similar to building a house. Once it is built, the builder walks away, and it stands on its own accord. In esse is more akin to the light from a candle or the liquid in a vessel. George Hayward Joyce, S.J., explained that, where the light of the candle is dependent on the candle's continued existence, not only does a candle produce light in a room in the first instance, but its continued presence is necessary if the illumination is to continue. If it is removed, the light ceases. Again, a liquid receives its shape from the vessel in which it is contained, but were the pressure of the containing sides withdrawn, it would not retain its form for an instant. Quote, this form of the argument is far more difficult to separate from a purely first cause argument than is the example of the house's maintenance above, because here the first cause is insufficient without the candles of vessel's continued existence. Thus, Leibniz's argument is in fieri, while Aquinas' argument is both in fieri and in esse. This distinction is an excellent example of the difference between a deistic view and a theistic view. As a general trend, the modern slants on the cosmological argument, including the Kalam argument, tend to lean very strongly towards an in fieri argument. Objections and counter-arguments. What caused the first cause? One objection to the argument is that it leaves open the question of why the first cause is unique in that it does not require any causes. Proponents argue that the first cause is exempt from having a cause, while opponents argue that this is special pleading or otherwise untrue. Critics often press that arguing for the first cause's exemption raises the question of why the first cause is indeed exempt, whereas defenders maintain that this question has been answered by the various arguments, emphasizing that none of its major forms rests on the premise that everything has a cause. Secondly, it is argued that the premise of causality has been arrived at via posteriori reasoning, which is dependent on experience. David Hume highlighted this problem of induction and argued that causal relations were not true a priori. However, as to whether inductive or deductive reasoning is more valuable still remains a matter of debate, with the general conclusion being that neither is prominent. Opponents of the argument tend to argue that it is unwise to draw conclusions from an extrapolation of causality beyond experience. Identity of a first cause. The basic cosmological argument merely establishes that a first cause exists, not that it has the attributes of a theistic God, such as omniscience, omnipotence, and omnibenevolence. This is why the argument is often expanded to show that at least some of these attributes are necessarily true. For instance, in the modern Kalam argument given above, existence of causal loops. A causal loop is a form of predestination paradox arising where traveling backwards in time is deemed a possibility. A sufficiently powerful entity in such a world would have the capacity to travel backwards in time to a point before its own existence, and then create itself, thereby initiating everything which follows from it. The usual reason which is given to refute the possibility of a causal loop is it requires that the loop as a whole be its own cause. Richard Hanley argues that causal loops are not logically, physically, or epistemically impossible. The only possibly objectionable feature that all causal loops share is that coincidence is required to explain them. Existence of infinite causal chains. David Hume and later Paul Edwards have invoked a similar principle in the criticisms of the cosmological argument. Rowe Urbino has called the principle the Hume-Edwards principle. If the existence of every member of a set is explained, the existence of that set is thereby explained. Nevertheless, David White argues that the notion of an infinite causal regress providing a proper explanation is fallacious. Furthermore, Demi states that even if the succession of causes is infinite, the whole chain still requires a cause. To explain this, suppose there exists a causal chain of infinite contingent beings. If one asks the question, why are there any contingent beings at all, it won't help to be told that there are contingent beings because other contingent beings caused them. Quote, that answer would just presuppose additional contingent beings. An adequate explanation of why some contingent beings exist would invoke a different sort of being, a necessary being that is not contingent. A response might suppose each individual is contingent but the infinite chain as a whole is not, or the whole infinite causal chain to be its own cause. Severanson argues that there is an infinite and complex causal structure. White tried to introduce an argument without appeal to the principle of sufficient reason and without denying the possibility of an infinite causal regress. Big Bang cosmology. Some cosmologists and physicists argue that a challenge to the cosmological argument is the nature of time. One finds that time just disappears from the Wheeler-DeWitt equation. The Big Bang theory states that it is the point in which all dimensions came into existence, the start of both space and time. Then, the question, what was there before the universe, makes no sense. The concept of before becomes meaningless when considering a situation without time. This has been put forward by J. Richard Guthrie, James E. Gunn, David N. Schramm, and Beatrice Tinsley, who said that asking what occurred before the Big Bang is like asking what is north of the North Pole. However, some cosmologists and physicists do attempt to investigate causes for the Big Bang, using such scenarios as the collision of membranes. Philosopher Edward Fesser states that classical philosophers' arguments for the existence of God do not care about the Big Bang or whether the universe had a beginning. The question is not about what God thinks started or how long they have been going, but rather what keeps them going.